Montana Territory, April 1884. The sky still held the scent of wet earth and ash as the stagecoach rattled into Hollow Creek, its wheels cutting muddy tracks through the road that had only just begun to dry. Marigold Carter sat stiff in her seat, hands clutching a worn satchel that held the last of her life in high willow. The flood had taken the rest: her shop, her neighbors, her home, and the church where she was to marry a man who never came looking for her afterward. The water had risen fast, dragging houses and horses down the valley. She remembered gripping her little brother's hand as they climbed onto the roof, but it was not enough. Zion was gone, just 7 years old and gone. Now she was 23, alone, and arriving in a town she had never seen before. The coach lurched to a stop outside the post office, and Marigold stepped down, boots sinking slightly into the soft ground. Her dress clung to her from the damp, and her heart felt just as heavy. "Miss Carter," a voice called out. She turned slowly. A tall man stood by the edge of the boardwalk, hat in hand, dusty boots, sun-browned skin, and the kind of quiet steadiness a woman could lean on if she dared. He looked about 27 or 28. His dark hair curled slightly under his hat, and his shirt sleeves were rolled up like he had been working since sunup. "I am," she said, voice hoarse. He stepped forward, offering his hand. "Name's Nolan Dempsey. Sheriff wrote me, said you needed help settlin' in. I build homes." "Figured I could offer more than a room above the saloon." Marigold blinked. "You are offering me a house," he nodded. "Not yet, but I will build you one room at a time." She stared at him, unsure why tears burned at the back of her eyes. Maybe it was the way he said it, like it was not charity but a promise. She took his hand. It was warm and calloused, and he held hers like someone who meant to steady her, not trap her. "Thank you," she whispered. Nolan led her down the street to a small cottage near the edge of town. He held the door open, and she stepped into the scent of cedar and soap. It was only 2 rooms, but it was clean, quiet, and dry. "You stay here until we get yours started," he said. "This place belongs to an old friend. He passed last year. I check on it now and then." She nodded, setting her bag down gently on the table. Her fingers lingered on the wood grain. "Do you know what you want yours to look like?" he asked. "The house, I mean." "No," she said softly, "but I will know when I see it." Nolan tapped the brim of his hat. "I will come by tomorrow. We will ride out and find a good spot." When the door closed behind him, Marigold let her knees fold beneath her. She sat on the floor, staring at the walls. The silence was thick, but not cold. For the first time in weeks, she felt something shift inside her. Not hope, not yet, but the ground beneath her was solid. Nolan returned the next morning, just after sunup. He brought 2 horses and a thermos of coffee. Marigold rode beside him without speaking much. Her eyes scanned the hills and trees until they reached a wide patch of land just past the creek. The grass was tall and the river curved gently nearby. She dismounted and walked a few steps into the field. "This is it," she said. Nolan smiled. "Then this is where we will build it." They started the next day. He brought tools and she brought patience. Nolan dug post holes while she measured the wood. He showed her how to steady the beam while he hammered it into place. Her palms blistered, but she did not stop. Each evening he walked her back to the cottage. They talked more now. She learned he had grown up near Bozeman, had built barns and cabins since he was 16, and had once lost his brother to a winter storm. She told him about her parents gone in a fire when she was 17 and how she had raised Zion after that. "I thought I would marry," she said one night as they sat on the porch, "before the flood, but he never showed after it happened, never wrote, never asked." Nolan's jaw tightened. "Then he never deserved you." She looked over at him, surprised. His voice had been low but sure. "I do not know if I deserve much of anything right now," she said. He looked at her then, really looked. "You deserve peace, and I will help you build it." The first room went up in 5 days. It was a square frame with an open roof, but to Marigold, it felt like a cathedral. She stood inside the frame and turned slowly, letting the sunlight hit her face. "It is happening," she whispered. Nolan leaned against one of the beams, watching her. Room by room. A week later, she surprised him by bringing lunch to the site: bread, beans, and a peach pie she had bartered for. Nolan laughed when he saw her walking up the path, skirt hitched slightly to keep it out of the mud. "Just pie would have been enough," he said. "I like feeding people," she said simply. That night, he stayed longer. They sat at the edge of the new frame, legs dangling. The stars came out slowly, one by one. "Do you ever get scared?" she asked. He looked thoughtful. "When I care about something, yeah. Do you care about this?" "I do," she nodded, hands clasped in her lap. "Do you care about me?" she asked, voice barely above a breath. His hand found her slowly, fingers closing around them like a vow. "I do." She looked down at their joined hands, then up at his face. "Good, because I think I care about you too." He leaned in, slow and careful, and pressed his lips to hers. It was not rushed. It was not desperate. It was warm and steady and real, the kind of kiss that made her believe in something again. When they pulled apart, she smiled. "One room at a time," she said. Nolan nodded. "And we are not stopping." The wind curled through the cottonwoods as spring deepened, carrying the scent of thawing earth and the first wild onions. Marigold stood beside the second frame wall, steadying the beam as Nolan drove the nail home with 2 clean swings. Her arms ached, but the kind that came from doing something that would last. "Wall'll hold," Nolan said, stepping back to check the angle. She brushed a strand of hair from her cheek, smudging her face with sawdust. "So long as we don't get a summer storm before the roof's on," he nodded, eyes sweeping the sky. "Won't take long now. I've got the rafters milled, just waitin' on the nails from Miles City." Marigold glanced over at the stack of lumber laid beneath a canvas tarp. "How'd you learn to build like this?" Nolan didn't answer right away. He picked up the next board, ran his hand along the grain. "My pa taught me. He built lined shacks through the bitterroots. Said a man ought to leave something behind better than he found it." She watched him lift the beam, fitting it into place. "Did he?" He tried. "Some of it stuck." Nolan gave a small shrug, then looked at her. "You ever think about teachin'? You've got the way of it." "The way you ask things." Marigold blinked. "I wanted to. A few years back, I went to the county board in Helena, but they said there wasn't room, and then Zion needed me, so I stayed." Her voice didn't hitch, but her hand curled against her side. "He'd have liked you. He always asked why I didn't know how to build things." Nolan set the hammer down gently. "If you wanted to learn more than just holding up beams, I could show you. Framing, joinery, even how to set a window square." "I'd like that," she said, her voice quiet but sure. They worked until the light bent low across the hills, honey gold and long-shadowed. When Nolan packed up the tools, Marigold gathered the cloth bundle she'd brought. Inside was a folded square of cotton she'd pieced together from scraps. The color didn't match much, faded blue, a patch of green, but she handed it to him like it was whole. "It's not finished," she said, "but it's meant for the table when it's built." Nolan unfolded it, fingers tracing the seams. "You made this. I've been sewing in the evenings. Something to keep my hands from remembering too much." He folded it back with care, not saying anything for a moment. Then, "I'll build the table first so it has somewhere to sit." The next day brought a visitor. A woman rode up on a stout bay mare, skirts hitched for riding and a rifle slung across her back. Her hair was salt and pepper, braided in a thick plait that reached her waist. She dismounted with practiced ease and strode toward the half-built house. "You're the one Nolan's helping?" she asked. Marigold stepped forward. "Yes, I'm Marigold Carter, Ruth Killian. I keep goats on the North Ridge. Nolan told me you'd come from downriver." Her voice wasn't unkind, but it held weight. "You got kin?" "No," Marigold answered simply. Ruth nodded once. "You'll need a smokehouse if you plan to stay through winter. I'll help build it after the house is sound." Marigold didn't know what to say. She wasn't used to offers that came without strings. "Thank you," she said finally. Ruth gave a short grunt. "We don't let folks drown twice out here. Once is ruin enough." That night, Nolan walked her back by lantern light. The air was heavy with the hush of dusk, and the frogs had begun their slow chorus by the creek. "You've got a way of drawing people in," he said. "I didn't do anything." "You stayed," he said. "That counts." They reached the cottage porch and paused. He looked down at her, lantern casting lines of gold across his jaw. "I've been thinking about the second room," he said. "It doesn't need to be a storehouse. We could make it a reading room for quiet." "I'd like that," she said. "Maybe I could keep books there. Teach some of the children if their parents allow." "That's what I hoped you'd say." Marigold touched the doorframe, then turned back. "You ever wonder what it'd be like if we'd met before?" Nolan leaned against the porch post, considering. I used to think timing was everything. Now I think it's what folks do with the time they're given that matters. She stepped closer, and he didn't move away. I wasn't ready before, she said. I know. Their hands found each other, steady and warm. There was no kiss that night, just the stillness between them, thick with understanding. And when she stepped inside, she carried the weight of the lantern's glow with her, as if the light had settled deep in her chest and decided to stay. The ridge behind the house broke into bloom, as May wore on larkspur and arrowleaf balsam root curling out of the soil like they'd been waiting for someone to notice. Marigold stood barefoot on the packed dirt floor of what would be the kitchen, brushing flour from her palms. Her apron tied askew after a morning of mixing dough on a borrowed table Nolan had carried down from the loft of the old feed barn. "You're not supposed to be baking until the chimney's drawn right," Nolan called from the ladder as he aligned another roof beam overhead. "I didn't use the stove," she said, shielding her eyes from the sun to look up at him. "Ruth lent me her Dutch oven. I buried it in the coals." He paused, one hand wrapped around the beam, and grinned down at her. "Well, that smell's been driving me mad since I stepped off the horse." "It's just bannock," she said, picking up the wrapped parcel from the windowsill, "but I added wild sage. Thought it might taste like the prairie smells after rain." He climbed down slow, boots steady against each rung, and took the bundle from her hands. They sat on the edge of the back stoop, where the grass had been flattened from their boots over the weeks. "I've been thinking," she said as he broke off a piece, "about the river. I want to build a fence between the yard and the water, not to keep it out, just to know it's there without it being a threat." Nolan chewed, then nodded. "We can run a pine rail along the top bank. I'll show you how to set the posts wide so it won't rot fast." "I'd like that." She brushed crumbs from her lap. "I don't want to be afraid of it anymore." He looked at her then, eyes steady, brows softened by something close to reverence. "You don't look afraid." "I am," she said. "But I'm still here." Later, Ruth returned with 2 wooden crates filled with cured meat and a tangle of dried apple slices. She set them down inside the kitchen frame without ceremony and dusted her hands. "You'll need to trade for a milk cow soon," she said, glancing at the half-built roof. "No use building a pantry to keep it empty." Marigold nodded, unsure how to answer. Ruth lifted a slab of smoked pork. "I know a trader near Fort Benton. He's fair. I'll ride with you come June." Nolan looked up from his work on the rafters. "You sure you want to head that far west?" "Don't worry, boy," Ruth said. "I've ridden farther for less." She turned to Marigold. "I'll show you how to choose a good udder. Don't trust a man who sells you a cow without letting her graze first." Marigold smiled, something quiet and grateful blooming behind her ribs. "Thank you. I'd appreciate that." That evening, Nolan didn't leave after supper. Instead, he helped her carry the empty crates to the shed behind the cottage. The air was thick with lilac and the low hum of crickets. As they stepped into the shelter's shadow, she paused, fingers trailing the doorframe. "Do you think you'll always stay in Hollow Creek?" she asked. He leaned against the outer wall, arms folded, watching the horizon darken. "I reckon I will. I've never needed more than open sky and good work, and now—" He looked at her. "Now I've got something worth staying for." She stepped closer, her voice soft as the dusk settling around them. "Do you mean me?" "I do." She reached up, brushing his cheekbone with the backs of her fingers. "I didn't think I'd ever trust someone again, but then you showed up with your hammer and your quiet, and you didn't ask me to be anything but here." "I never needed anything more than that," he said. She rose onto her toes, pressing her mouth to his, slow and sure. His hands found her waist, pulling her in, not desperate but certain, like anchoring a post deep into the ground. When they parted, her breath caught against his collarbone. "I want to build it all with you, the house, the land. A life." He held her close, his voice no louder than the wind. "We already are." They stood like that for a long while, the moon rising behind them, silvering the rafters and the half-set beams. The smell of sage lingered in the warm air, and somewhere in the distance, a nightbird called low and steady like a promise being kept. The roof went on before the wheatgrass turned gold, nailed down in the hush of early mornings while the air still held its chill. By the time the chimney bricks were laid and the hearth cured, the house had taken its shape, squat, sturdy, and square backed against the prevailing wind. Marigold stood in the doorway just past sundown, watching the shadows stretch long across the plank floor. The smell of fired clay lingered in the air, and her shoulders carried the ache of a full day's work. But her hands were steady now. "I had a letter from the county clerk," she said as Nolan leaned his tools against the wall. "There's been a petition to start a proper school here. Just a single room to begin with." He unbuttoned his cuffs, folding them back before answering. "You thinking of signing on, if they'll take me?" "I've nothing formal, but I can read and keep order better than most." "You've got more than most," he said, then added, "I built a school once out near Phillipsburg. They used planks like these, cold in winter. But the children didn't complain much." "I'd like to see one rise from scratch," she said. "Not just for the children, for the mothers too, a place where their hands can rest for a few hours." Nolan looked at her then, not with surprise, but something deeper recognition, maybe. "You've got plans, Marigold Carter," she smiled, not with pride but quiet resolve. "I've got to start." The next morning, Nolan brought her to the old soppit up the ridge. He handed her a draw knife wrapped in oiled cloth. "This one belonged to my uncle. He'd be glad to see it in use again." She weighed it in her hands, the handle smooth from years of palms. "Is it time for the table?" "Nearly. I've been letting the boards rest. Come Sunday, we'll lay them out." She looked around the clearing where the boards had been stacked to cure. "You always work this careful, only when it matters." They spent the afternoon peeling bark and shaping legs. Nolan showed her how to tilt the blade just enough to follow the grain, and she worked slow, careful not to gouge the wood. "You listen better than most men I've taught," he said, teasing just enough. "I'm not afraid to be wrong," she said. "I've had a fair share of practice." That night, she wiped her hands on her apron and set a pot of dried beans to soak. "Would you stay for dinner?" she asked. Nolan hesitated, then nodded. "If you'll have me." She poured water into the basin by the door, her back to him. "I wouldn't ask if I didn't mean it." He stepped closer, not touching her, just close enough that she could feel the warmth of him. "Then yes." They ate by lamplight, knees brushing beneath the table she would soon replace with their own. The cottage was still borrowed, but it didn't feel borrowed now, not with his coat hanging by the door and his voice low across the table. "I've been thinking," he said, setting down his cup. "Once the house is finished, I'd like to offer something more permanent." She met his eyes, her spoon paused just above her bowl. "I know I can't offer much, no silver, no fine furniture, but the roof'll hold and the walls won't shift." Marigold's heart thudded low in her chest. "I didn't come here looking to marry again," she said carefully, "but I didn't come here to stay alone either." "I'm not asking yet," he said, voice soft. "Just saying when the time comes, I'll be ready." She looked down at her bowl, then back up. "I think I'll be ready too." Outside, the breeze stirred the timothy grass, brushing it against the sill. No grand declarations, no sudden promises, just the quiet certainty of two people building toward something neither of them had dared hope for only weeks before. When he stood to leave, she walked him to the porch. He paused on the step. "Can I walk you to the ridge Sunday after we finish the table? Show you where the wild plums bloom?" "I'd like that," she said. He touched his hat, then bent, pressing his lips to her forehead, not urgent, not a question. Just a vow made without words. She watched him disappear into the dusk, his shape folding into the land like he'd always belonged to it. And for the first time since the flood, she didn't brace for what might be taken next. She simply stood in the doorway of a house still smelling of sap and smoke, and let the stillness settle around her like something earned. By the time the table was finished, the fields beyond the house had ripened into a soft hush of green. Nolan brushed the last of the sawdust from the plank top and stepped back, his thumb running along the clean edge where the legs met the apron with a tight dovetail. Marigold stood beside him, her hand resting flat against the grain. "It'll carry a lifetime," he said. "I don't want anything less," she replied. They carried it inside together, the legs wrapped in canvas so the doorway wouldn't scuff them. The floor creaked under the weight, but held firm. Nolan set it by the front window, where the light came in slow and golden by afternoon. Marigold fetched the square of patchwork she'd finished the week before and laid it across the center. She looked at him. "This is the first thing I've owned that didn't come from someone else's grief." He didn't answer. He only reached for her hand and laced their fingers together, his touch warm and unhurried. They made the walk to the ridge after supper, the light spilling long across the grass. Nolan led her along a narrow deer trail that opened into a hollow, where a stand of plum trees twisted low over the rise. Pale blossoms clung to the branches, their scent faint and sweet. Marigold pressed her fingertips to one bloom, careful not to break it from the stem. "I used to imagine a place like this," she said. "Somewhere quiet, somewhere I could rest without looking over my shoulder." Nolan knelt by the tree roots, brushing back a patch of dry earth. "This spot's been here a long time. You just needed time to reach it." She lowered herself beside him, letting her skirt pool around her knees. "I want to marry you." He didn't blink, didn't startle. He only turned his head and looked at her, slow as the wind moving through the grass. "You sure?" he asked. "I'm sure." He reached into the inside pocket of his coat and pulled out a ring, simple gold, the edges rubbed smooth. "It was my mother's. She wore it until she passed." Marigold held out her hand without speaking. He slid the band onto her finger, and it settled there like it had always been meant to. They married a week later under the cottonwood behind the house. Ruth stood as witness, her braid tied with a strip of blue calico. The preacher rode in from the next county, his boots still caked with the dust of the road. There were no flowers, just the wild plum petals that drifted down from Marigold's hair when the wind lifted. After the vows, Nolan didn't kiss her like a man claiming something. He kissed her like a man who'd waited, who knew what he was holding. They moved into the new house that night. The fire crackled low in the hearth, the chimney drawing true. Marigold placed her sewing basket under the window and hung the dried herbs Ruth had brought from her garden. Nolan set his tools in a chest by the door, the blades wrapped in oiled cloth. They lay together in the narrow bed he'd built when the roof first went on. No words passed between them, just the soft sound of breath and the hush of linen shifting. Her hand found his in the dark, and he lifted it to his chest, holding it there as the warmth of the fire faded to embers. By midsummer, she'd been offered the teaching post. The schoolhouse was little more than a drafty clapboard room near the grain store, but the children came, boots clattering, faces scrubbed. Marigold taught them how to read by tracing the shape of the letters in flour spread on pine boards. She read aloud each day, stories of rivers and wide skies, of people who kept going even when the world turned hard. Nolan spent his days building fences and fixing roofs. His name carried in quiet praise from homestead to homestead. In the evenings, he came home dusty and tired, and she met him at the door with hands still ink-stained and full of stories about the children's questions. By autumn, the yard held a fence of split pine, just as she'd asked. Beyond it, the river ran steady, no longer a threat, only a presence known, acknowledged, and held at its distance. The night the frost came, Nolan brought in the last of Ruth's squash from the garden bed. Marigold wrapped them in cloth and set them in the root cellar. He didn't speak until they sat beside the fire, her feet tucked beneath her. "I never thought I'd have this," he said. She looked up. "What? A place that holds." She leaned in, resting her cheek against his shoulder. "You built it, you filled it." The wind outside caught the edge of the shutter and rattled it once, gently. Inside, the fire cracked, the kind of sound that makes a house feel lived in. Marigold lifted her face to his. "There's a child on the way." His arms came around her without hesitation. He didn't speak, but she felt him breathe deep, like the world had steadied beneath him. They sat like that, hearts stitched close, the fire dancing across the walls they'd raised with their own hands. Seasons passed. The house grew fuller, books on the shelf, a cradle by the hearth, boots small and scattered by the door. Ruth still rode down with goat's milk and advice no one asked for but always heeded. The fence held through every thaw and the river stayed where it belonged. And when the days stretched long again, and the plum trees bloomed, Nolan carried their daughter to the ridge and laid her in Marigold's arms beneath the same branches where they'd promised one another everything. They named her Zion, because some names don't belong to grief forever. And the house held, always,